This is one of the most famous Maimorim in all of Chassidus. Pasach Eliyahu, Torah Or, Parshas Vayeira. Any person who's, to whatever degree, initiated into the world of the Haskalah of Chabad, the philosophy of Chabad, the mysticism of Chabad, is familiar with this Maimed and its various versions of notes provided by the subsequent Rabbeim. This particular Maimed has notes from the Tzemach Tzedek that were then further annotated by the Rebbe Rashab, and they've been published in a volume that I think is over 100 pages of notes on this, relatively speaking, short little Maimed. This is really an important Maimed in the world of Chabad philosophy and scholarship. In other words, this Maimed doesn't, at least on the surface, talk psychology and life and lessons, but it's strict mysticism. And in effect, what this Maamar attempts to do is give a philosophical explanation for fundamental mystical truths. In other words, some of the most basic concepts in Kabbalah will be explored in the Maamar. I don't think the Maamar is necessarily going to change the mysticism, but using philosophy, using metaphor, using using the metaphor of the person, will give a philosophical insight that will make it a little bit easier for us to understand what is, on the one hand, basic, and at the same time, most evasive, most difficult to comprehend concepts in Kabbalah, concepts in mysticism. And I really need to warn you that this is the kind of Maamar you learn it, you understand it, you think about it, you say, I don't understand a word. In other words, I don't see how this is helpful. And then you learn it again, you think about it again, and you come up almost to the same conclusion. This is the kind of Maamar that after you study it and you have it taught to you, it really only registers when you think about it. And even then, you need Sayata Deshmaya, you need God's help to have the Maamar resonate with you and to have an appeal for you and so forth. I want to start first of all by making an observation. This Maamar begins Pasach Eliyahu, which is part of the davening Friday afternoon, of course, before Shabbos. We say Pasach Eliyahu in preparation for Shabbos. But above Pasach Eliyahu, it says Shayuch lepasuk erdano, which means to say the connection between this Maamar and our Parsha are the words erdano. In this week's Parsha, Parshas Vayeira, we read, of course, how the people of Sodom are no good. They're corrupt. They're evil, and they're also self-righteous, which is the worst kind of evil. And God Almighty says to Abraham, I'm going to destroy them. But before I do, I'm going to check them out. So the Pasuk says, I will descend into Sodom, and I will see whether they're as corrupt as I think they are, or as Rashi explains it, or perhaps they're corrupt, but not as corrupt, and I'll punish them accordingly. And of course the question is obvious. What does it mean God is descending? What is he climbing down a ladder? He's going down to a lower floor. He's journeying from apartment to apartment. Hashem is everywhere and everything. And of course this is not a new question. This question has been asked by many theologians. And frankly, it's not the only the only case where you see God discussed in a spatial context, as though there's a here and a there in relationship with God. So that's what this Maamar, that's what the link between this Maamar and the Parsha is. The Maamar doesn't talk very much about Erdena, it talks about Kabbalah, as I'll explain to you momentarily, but the connection between the Maamar and the Parsha is the idea of God moving from place to place needs to be comprehended. In Jewish philosophy, that means in non-mystical circles, the answer to this illusion, Erdano, what does it mean God is descending from one place to another, is like all of anthropomorphic references to God, one size fits all. There's one philosophical answer to all these questions, and the answer, of course, is Dibra Teira Kaloshem B'nei Adam. The Torah speaks in the language of man. In other words, of course God is not descending, but when we perceive His presence in our world and in our lives in a more intimate way, we describe it as if He's entered into our reality, as He's descended into our world, although in fact He's always here in an unchanging way. So the philosophers resolve Erdana by saying God is not descending. His presence in our perception is described as a descent, although it's not really happening. Mysticism, Kabbalah, strict Kabbalah, isn't satisfied with the philosophical view, because the philosophical view says in effect that the Torah is not to be understood literally. The Torah says, God says, I will descend, and the philosopher says, well, He's not descending, we just think He's descending. It looks like He's descending to us. And therefore the mystics will answer this question by saying, Erdana doesn't go on God, it goes on godliness. The midas of Atzilus, that there's a higher midah and a lower midah, a vav and a k, and haketza akoso haba'o elai, the haketzakas hey. In other words, God is descending, godliness is descending from the level of vav to the level of hey to have an effect on the world. So Kabbalists, and you can look it up in the Rishonim on the Pasuk, would explain this Pasuk in a way that gives it a much more true resonance. In other words, although God is not moving around, but since there are levels, and of course there's no level in God, levels are only in godliness, and there's a higher level of godliness and a lower level of godliness, so the Torah can afford to say Erdana, not as an allusion to God Himself, but a higher level of godliness descending to a lower level of godliness to involve itself in the lower worlds. So Kabbalah, if you will, takes the philosophy to the next level. The philosophers say God's descent doesn't really happen, it's just an allegory. The mystics say God's descent doesn't really happen, it's true not of God but of godliness. Chassidus has a third dimension. Erdana means God Himself will descend. What does it mean God Himself descends? God Himself doesn't descend. God Himself is everything and everywhere and unchanging. So the answer is going to be that the Sefiros of Atzilus descend, just like the Kabbalists say. The Vav descends to the Hey, the higher level of godliness descends to the lower level of godliness. What Chassidus is going to add, or what this Maimid is going to emphasize, is that since the Sefiros of Atzilus are connected to God, their descent is His descent. In other words, Chassidus isn't simply repeating what Kabbalah is saying, they're adding another aspect. And the other aspect is that the Kabbalistic idea that a higher level of godliness descends to a lower level of godliness, and in that context you can speak of space, higher and lower, is true. But since godliness is linked to God, as this Maimid will argue, and let me assure you that it's intense and subtle, and you're just going to have to do two things: listening to me, A, give me the benefit of the doubt, and B, think everything over a few times, because the ideas are really very refined, very idyllic concepts. But what's going to emerge from this Maimid is that when you say that the Sefiros of Atzilus are descending into the lower worlds, you are saying, in effect, God is descending into the lower worlds, because the Sefiros of Atzilus are linked to the source, to what is higher than the Sefiros, in such a way that their descent is His descent. In other words, you will come out of this Maimid with three versions of Erdana. A philosophical version of Erdana, that it's a mashal, a mystical version of Erdana, that it goes on the Sefiros, and a Chassidic commentary on the mystical version, that the Sefiros are connected to God, and as a result, the Erdana can at least indirectly be associated not only with the Sefiros, but what our Maimon is going to be calling Ant, God Himself. I'm not discussing Erdana anymore. My plan is, and of course, as everybody knows, plans are made to be broken. Let's see how this all works out. That when we get to the end of the Maimon, I will revisit the Erdana and explore it with you some more, or perhaps just repeat what I've said. I want to get to the Maimon itself, and I've been given the good fortune, the opportunity to learn this Maimon over the course of several weeks so that we can delve into it, because there are some very, very meaningful and subtle and yet fundamental concepts of Chassidus that deserve our attention, and by the kindness of the people who sponsored these shiurim and support these shiurim, and by the grace of God, we have the opportunity to learn this Maamar and to learn it, hopefully, in a most useful and a constructive way. Before I get to the Maamar proper, I want to give you, if you will, a first introduction. It says in Derech Mitzvah in Shoyrish Mitzvah Atfila Perek Beis, that the Baal Shem Tov outlawed the study of Kabbalah. Baal Shem Tov said, don't learn Kabbalah. It's almost like saying that he's allowed to the study of Kabbalah. It seems ridiculous, but that's what it says. The Baal Shem Tov was opposed to learning Kabbalah. And the reason was because the Baal Shem Tov feared that we'd be Megashem Elokus. We'd make godliness very, very material. Or alternatively, we wouldn't have the sensitivity, lahoitzi dvarim megashmi yusam, which means to remove things from their material form and appreciate the nature of their abstractness and refinement and so forth. In other words, Kabbalah uses form. And for the most part, the form it uses is anthropomorphic. Anthropomorphic form is physical and human. And you're applying that to God. And unless you're careful, you make God into a Superman, which is foolish. Besides for the fact that it's wrong and heresy, it's just foolish. And the Baal Shem Tov says you need a Kabbalist's sensitivity not to allow the form that is the vehicle for the communication of the mystical ideas to become a barrier between yourself and the mysticism you're intent on pursuing. In other words, although so much of Kabbalah is mebisari echselakah, how the human being is in the image of God, and by studying man we can have a sense of God and godliness, you have to be very careful that the godly version that you come up with after extrapolating backwards from man is in fact refined to the degree that it represents and reflects godliness and God in a healthy and a constructive way. Now, of course, we study Chassidus. Chassidus is a philosophy. In other words, Chassidus gives logical explanations, philosophical explanations, reasonable explanations for mystical ideas. And through Chassidus, we can comprehend these ideas more profoundly, more deeply. In other words, we can connect to them better. And hopefully at the same time, remain loyal to the refinement that the mysticism represents. I just want to share a little tiny piece of history that the previous Rabbi discusses in his many writings and sichos about the history of Chabad. And that is that the Alter Rebbe, for the first third of his life, for the first 20 years of his life, had no connection to Chassidus whatsoever. There was a great effort made by the Baal Shem Tov himself and all the other people who knew the Alter Rebbe, who were involved with the Baal Shem Tov, that the Alter Rebbe never even hear the Baal Shem Tov's name, let alone study the Baal Shem Tov's teachings, and certainly not visit the Baal Shem Tov. The Alter Rebbe didn't travel to Chassidus till he was either 18 and a half or 19 and a half, and at that point, the Baal Shem Tov had already been nostalgic, had already passed away, and he went to the Maggid. So the Alter Rebbe really was on his own. And it can be said correctly that he was self-educated until he met the Holy Maggid of Mezrich when he was almost 20 years old. And then he was exposed to Chassidus and the Derech and Avodah and so forth. What is most interesting is that the Alter Rebbe, as a non-Chassid, as a young man who had no exposure to the Baal Shem Tov and to his philosophy and to his Chassidus, did so many things precisely as the Baal Shem Tov was doing them, or as Chassidus was doing them, without realizing that they were Chassidus. For example, the Alter Rebbe undertook to help people with Parnasa by giving people loans, which was something that the Baal Shem Tov had done, and encouraging people to move away from the big cities to the villages and farms and roadsides and forests and fisheries so they could make a living in the traditional Eastern European way, which required people to be thinly distributed all over Poland as opposed to being gathered in large groups. The Alter Rebbe did exactly what the Baal Shem Tov had been doing without even knowing the Baal Shem Tov's name, which I find incredible. Another thing the previous Rebbe says is that the Alter Rebbe was a great Kabbalist. Prior to meeting the Maggid, he was a master of Torah, he was a genius of Torah and a master of Kabbalah who didn't only study Kabbalah but did meditations. He davened with the meditations of Kabbalah. The Rebbe would often mention that the Alter Rebbe was known as a young man as a Shala'id. His favorite Kabbalah was the Kabbalah of the Shalah, who was, so to speak, a disciple of the Arizal. And he not only learned but also taught Kabbalah to a following. Says the previous Rebbe, in that early stage of his life, when he was studying and teaching Kabbalah without any real teacher, the method of explaining Kabbalah to his followers was the very same method he would employ a half a century later as a Chabad Rebbe, which is he used philosophy and metaphor. In other words, Chassidus is so wonderful because it takes abstract ideas and uses metaphors which we can really comprehend. The human being, the physical world. And although understanding the metaphor properly doesn't necessarily automatically mean that you understand the mystical parallel to it, because of course every metaphor is different than this that it is a metaphor for, especially when you're dealing with mystical matter, still using physical things and the human being as the framework for explaining Kabbalah makes Kabbalah very logical, very comprehensible, and yet the real word is philosophical as opposed to mystical. In other words, you can truly comprehend it, and then you have to extrapolate backwards from the mashal to the nimshal. So the Alter Rebbe, by his very being, in other words, without the influence overtly of Chassidus, was doing what he would invent as the single greatest contribution of the Alter Rebbe to this world, which is the philosophy of Chabad Chassidus, using the framework of philosophy and metaphor and mebesariyach selaka and so forth and so on. And this is, to me at least, quite interesting. And finally, the Maamar we are going to learn is going to talk about concepts in Kabbalah. The concepts in Kabbalah are basic. In other words, not simple. They're not simple at all, but important, very important. There's one thing that must be stated emphatically and unequivocally now, and that is, Kabbalah does not talk about God, period. Kabbalah teaches a form of worship of God, a system of meditations and so forth, but Kabbalah does not talk about God, what we would call in our culture Atzmos. Kabbalah talks about godliness, Or, godliness. If you want to discuss God, you're going to have to study Chassidus. Chassidus talks about God. And philosophy talks about God. Kabbalah talks about Hishtalshelus, about godliness. This Maamar is going to explore a variety of concepts in Kabbalah. In short, the Ein Sof, the Sefiros or Atzilus, and the lower worlds. That's the whole Maamar. The abstractness of the Ein Sof, the complicated relationship of the Ein Sof and Sefiros, how they're so connected yet so separated at the same time, and the quantum leap between the Sefiros, Atzilus, and the lower worlds. None of what I just said is God. All three ideas, the Ein Sof, the Sefiros, and the lower worlds, are dimensions in godliness. And it's critical that we be upfront and appreciate this for a variety of different reasons. And one of them is because godliness is complicated. Godliness is sophisticated. Godliness is deep. Godliness is not to be understood by the faint of mind. God, simplest thing in the world. Everybody knows him, everybody understands him, everybody can relate to him. He's on the front page, he's at the tip of our tongue, he's the simplest truth. And in fact, one of the short little comments that the Alter Rebbe is going to just throw into this Maimer, which is one of the most famous innovations of Chassidus. In other words, an idea that the Alter Rebbe says that Kabbalah doesn't say is Hamoiru b'his galus, which means to say all of the fanciness of Kabbalah and the revelations and the concealments and the contractions and the re-exposures is all about godliness. The Rebishter, as little children call him, the one above, Hamoir, Hashem himself, who b'his galus, is not only everywhere, he's fully exposed and fully available. Little children have a very easy time with God, although they have a very difficult time with, even simple concepts, let alone concepts like godliness. So it's critical that we understand that Kabbalah discusses Hishtalshlus, Sefiros, godliness. This Maimer is a commentary on Kabbalah, or it's a series of metaphors that enlighten and reveal mystical ideas. This Maimer does a little bit more than simply reveal mystical ideas. This Maimer is intent on revealing mystical ideas and then, by doing so, enhance our understanding of the Pasach Eliyahu, like I told you earlier in my conversation. But the primary body, or the vast majority of this Maimer, is simply Chassidus enlightening philosophically mystical concepts. None of our Maimer is going to enlighten God. It's all about levels and godliness. Because God himself, as mysticism is complicated, so is God simple. So we're going to be dealing with godliness, elokus. And of course, what our Maimer is going to do in exploring elokus is using allegory, moshel and nimshel. And in Chassidus, the favorite moshel, the allegory or analog or example or metaphor which is most frequently employed to explain mystical ideas, is a person, is a human being. As the Pasuk says, Mi b'sari, from my flesh, echaz elakai, can have a sense of comprehension and even visualization of godliness. Why? Why is the preferred, why is the favorite moshel of Chassidus a human being? So of course the answer is because we are created in the image of God. Like it says in the Torah, Nasa Adam b'tzalmenu k'dmusenu, man is made b'tzelem udmus. We are in the image and the form of godliness. And consequently, it's not only that we're a good metaphor, but we are a precise metaphor. The human being is what the Rebbe calls in his writings a moshel mechuvan, an exact moshel. By studying a human being, you're not only finding a very helpful allegory or analog to enlighten mystical concepts, but you're actually finding the mirror image of those mystical concepts. Because, to quote Tanya chapter 3, nishtal shalumehem. In other words, the human form is an evolution, is a development from the mystical form. So by studying the human being, you're not just finding a useful mashal, you're actually finding a replica, a parallel for the mystical concepts, because we are created literally in the image of those mystical concepts. And as a consequence, you're not going to find a better metaphor, you're not going to find a better mashal to explain Kabbalistic ideas than the physical representation of those mystical ideas in this world, which is mibisari, which is the human being, which is Adam. Now, we're going to get to the Maimer. But first, I want to repeat again what I told you a few minutes ago. This Maimer is going to discuss three concepts in this order. Number one, the concept of the 10 Sefiros. The concept of the 10 Sefiros, like everything else in Kabbalah, is quite challenging. It's very hard to understand because godliness is God's light, right? It's a reflection of God. You have God, then you have God with a last name, Linus, right? God is the source with a capital S, and from the source you have light. Now logic would dictate that if the source is one and plain, so should the light be one and plain. So if God is one and plain, so then the light should also be one and plain. That is called, basically, the Ein Sof. Ein Sof is not God. God is Ein Le'tchila. The Ein Sof is the light of God. It, at least without exploring it too deeply and asking too many questions, it's a simple concept. The source is one and infinite. The light reflects that unity and the light reflects that infinity. But Sefiros are 10. 10 attributes, 10 faculties, 10 traits. How can there be a concept of Sefiros that are godly? God is one, his light should reflect his oneness and be one in turn. The Sefiros somehow can be 10, and if they're 10, none of them are infinite and plain. Each one of them must have a distinct and limiting personality, tendency, flavor, color, while at the same time, since they're the Sefiros, which means the lights of God, they somehow continue to reflect his infinite plainness. It is this dichotomy, it is this contradiction that makes understanding the Sefiros so extraordinarily hard. And you learn it, you understand it, you don't understand it, and you learn it, and you understand it, you don't understand it, and so forth. That's the first idea that our Maamar is going to explore. How 10 attributes that are obviously not plain and infinite can be godliness as opposed to being creations. The second point that our Maamar is going to explore is the separation, the tzimtzum, between the Ein Sof, which is higher than the Sefiros, and the Sefiros themselves. The enormous distance that exists between the Ein Sof, that is one and plain, and the 10 Sefiros that are somehow linked to the Ein Sof and yet entirely separated from the Ein Sof. In other words, we're going to talk about the dichotomy of godliness in the form of 10, or the godliness in the form of man, which is essentially the same thing. How can godliness be complicated and yet one at the same time? And the answer is going to be, well, it's very connected to the one, and yet it's totally separated from the one. If you find those two ideas contradictory, you're paying attention. And we're going to have to explore each one of those in kind. And the third idea of this Maamar is going to be that after we explain, on the one hand, how the how the 10 Sefiros are linked to the Ein Sof, and on the other hand, the 10 Sefiros are removed from the Ein Sof, we're going to have to conclude by enlightening that the combination of opposites, the separation of the Sefiros from the Ein Sof and the connection to the Ein Sof, explains, in effect, that the 10 Sefiros are really very much connected to the source, very much connected to Ein Sof, to godliness. So those are the three ideas. Number one, the 10 Sefiros. Number two, the separation. Number one, the connection between the 10 Sefiros and the Ein Sof. Number two, the separation between the 10 Sefiros and the Ein Sof. And number three, if you will, the fusion of those two ideas to give us a sense of, when you talk about Chokhmah of Ein Sof, you're really talking about God. But you're not talking about God. But you are talking about God. I wish you all a lot of luck. In other words, I wish myself a lot of luck. So this is the background to the Maamar. Tonight we explore idea one. And idea one is the connection between 10 Sefiros and the simplicity of the Ein Sof. How can a complex, detailed model, which must be limited, simultaneously be a reflection and in tune, in touch with the simplicity and oneness of the Ein Sof? That's the first idea, and hopefully with the help of God we'll do that tonight. And the other two ideas we'll do, of course, with the grace and kindness of God in the next couple of weeks. So here we go. Pasach Eliyahu. Eliyahu Hanavi opens. And I'm sure you know what Chassidus says, that whenever the expression Pasach, opens, is used, it means he's revealing a whole new channel of learning which has never been known before. Eliyahu Hanavi says, Antu Chad, you are one. And you don't go into account. Which means simply you're one, but you're not the first. You're one and you're removed from the number one as the first, and which is then followed by 2 and 3 and so forth. And antu da pikas asar tikunin v'choli. You have brought forward the 10 tikunin. Tikunin has a variety of translations. Let's translate them as pieces of jewelry or clothing. So Eliyahu Navi speaks about God and godliness and says, first of all, you're one. And second of all, from you emanates 10 attributes. So the Maamar will now explore this notion of 10 attributes. Line 2, please. Lahavin inyan zeh. We must understand this. Lama nekrayim yud sfiris b'shem tikunin. Why would we call the 10 sfiris clothing, or why would we call the 10 sfiris jewelry? It says the Rebbe tzarach lahagdim bir inyan hoslan nefesh. In order for me to explain to you the concept of the 10 sfiris and the contradictions that are involved in the phenomena of the Sefiros, that they're on the one hand 10, and they're called clothing or jewelry, and at the same time they're godliness, I must preface by giving you an analysis of the human soul. So forget the Sefiros for a while, and perhaps for a long while. We're not going to get back to the Sefiros until line 31, okay? So we're going to move on. Talk about the soul, the human soul. Line 3. The human soul, as it exists in relationship with itself. In other words, before it's any association with anything other than itself, is a light that is absolutely plain. Beli his chalkos, there are no individual aspects. There's no seichel, there's no wisdom. Umidis, there's no emotions. There is simply a singular, if you will, infinite light. Now that doesn't make the soul stupid or dispassionate. It simply means that there is no aspects to the soul. The soul doesn't have parts. You could say, this is the brain of the soul, this is the heart of the soul, and this is... The soul's entire unity is everything. All of the soul is wisdom, all of the soul is emotion, and when all of the soul is all of those things, that means in effect, the soul is none of those things as individual aspects, but rather the soul in its infinite plainness lacks none of those individual aspects. And when from the soul emerges wisdom and emotions as individual aspects, they are in effect garments of the soul, decorations for the soul, if you will. In other words, if you could meet a soul and ask the soul, can you see? The soul would say yes. From where do you see? And the soul would say, I see, because the soul doesn't have eyes. If you said to the soul, can you hear? The soul would say yes. From where do you hear? The soul would say, I hear. In other words, the same soul that sees, the soul that hears, understands, and feels, and all the rest, because the soul is one. And if the soul is one, there isn't an attribute of vision and hearing and reasoning and so forth. There is just an infinite plainness that lacks any of those attributes. And the division of individual attributes, intelligence as an entity unto itself, emotions as an entity unto itself, seeing and hearing as entities unto themselves, are called decorations, garments. They are secondary to the soul. They're around the soul. And as you'll see momentarily, the soul only needs them when it wants to relate to a body. The body has individuated aspects. So when the soul enters into the body, the soul must accommodate those divisions by affecting divisions within itself. But the soul as it exists, mitzad atzma, the soul as it exists in relationship with itself, is absolutely one. And the idea that from the plane one's soul radiates or steps forward, intelligence separately and emotion separately, they are in effect garments to the soul. The soul also possesses the idea of wisdom, intelligence, and emotions as individual aspects. Aval, however, in as much as their distinctive aspects, they are in the soul itself. The soul itself is absolutely one. The idea of individual attributes is outside of the soul. And one of the words that is employed to denote this phenomena is called garments, levushim. But the Zayed itself, the Tikkun Zayed itself, uses the word tikkunin, which doesn't mean garments, it means jewelry. Skip the parenthesis. Line 7. In Kabbalah, in Zayed, they're not called clothing, they're called jewelry, decorations. What does that mean? Shahanefesh mistakenes umislabeshes bohen. The soul becomes beautified and represented through them. In other words, the individual aspects are not only garments that cover over the soul, which is what the word levush would denote, but they're individual aspects that decorate and present the soul in a more favorable light, if you will. As Unkelus interprets, Al pasuk la yilbash gever simlas isha, that a man mustn't wear a woman's clothing. So the word he employs to denote wearing clothes is layitaken, which means he shouldn't beautify himself. Layitaken gever, but tikuni itasa, a man shouldn't beautify himself with women's clothing. So the word tikkun, which broadly means garments, clothing, in this particular context means clothing of honor, clothing of decoration, clothing that beautify, like jewelry. And therefore the Zoharic term tikkun doesn't simply denote clothing, but denotes decorative clothing, jewelry. The soul itself is beautified, is decorated with these garments, when one reacts from it. And as a consequence, the soul is one with its jewelry, as though the soul and its decorations were one and the same thing. First, a technical note. And I'm not going to explain this, I'm just going to tell you this is a statement of fact. That the word tikkunin is sometimes translated as garment, it's sometimes translated as representing, and it's sometimes translated as beautifying, like jewelry. And the difference between these various translations would have to do with whether we're seeing the tikkunim as something which is covering the soul, presenting the soul, or actually raising the soul up to a higher level. Calling the levushim tikkunim, meaning jewelry, actually is making, in a way, the soul more than it is by itself. These concepts are discussed in other places. It isn't important for us to get into this at this particular moment. Now, let me explain something to you. When you study the soul in Chassidus, the neshama in Chassidus, you encounter three basic dimensions, three basic levels that are really quite logical. The first dimension of the soul is called Giluyei HaNefesh, the expressions of the soul itself. In other words, the soul is infinite, the soul is plain, and when the soul speaks, it speaks in the language of infinity and plainness. Giluyei HaNefesh. What are expressions of the infinite plainness of the soul in its raw form? Ratzon, will, and tainug, delight. Will represents the soul because it represents the power of the soul. Willpower is infinite, relatively speaking. The soul is infinitely powerful. So when you use the metaphor of will, you're using a metaphor that communicates the urge, the unbelievable force of the soul, the infinity of the soul. Delight, tainug, on the other hand, doesn't represent or reflect the power of the soul, but the richness of the soul and the sublime nature of the soul, if you will. So will communicates one aspect of the soul, which is its force. Tainug, delight, communicates another aspect of the soul, which is its richness. But both will and delight are not aspects, they're not little personality traits of the soul. They are literally expressions. The soul's infinity comes forth in the urge of will. The soul's richness is represented through the metaphor of delight. It's called Giluyei HaNefesh. The soul speaks. Then there's a second dimension. And the second dimension is called Koiches HaNefesh. Kochot. Or the Sefiros, as it is Lamaila. The Koiches HaNefesh, the word koyach has three translations. It means a strength, it means a potential, and most important of all, it means a tool. The Koiches HaNefesh are the soul's tools. What does that mean? If a soul existed by itself in its own universe, it would have no need for any tools. It can express all of its urgencies, it can experience any of its delights without any interference. But the soul has relationships. because God created relationships for the soul. The very first relationship that the soul has is the relationship between the soul and the body it occupies. The second relationship that the soul has is the relationship that one human being, a soul in a body, has with a second human being, a soul in a body. Now let's just suffice to say that if you and I had a conversation and I told you I want to do this and you asked me why and I said because I want to, or this gives me delight, I wouldn't be very constructive and you wouldn't know how to eat my words. It'd be meaningless to you. If I want to do something that affects you, I have to give you a reason that you can process. Simply telling you I want to do something, I have an urge, I have a will, makes me crazy, not constructive. So I would come along to you and say I want to do something, and I wouldn't say I want to do it because I want to. I would say I want to do it, and here's my reason. I want to do it, and this is the emotional basis for my motivation. The moment I use reason, you can reason back. The moment I can give you an emotional basis for my position, you can offer an emotional response in kind, because reason is limited, and even emotions are limited. And it's a tool of interaction. For my soul to function in its body, and moreover for my soul to function in interacting with other souls, the interaction has to be useful. And a soul speaking soulese, as I tell it to my students, to another soul will affect one simple thing. One soul is going to destroy the other, because infinity that meets infinity just cancels each other. There's absolutely no room for both. So we have tools. The tools are vehicles by which the soul can constructively interact with other souls. Which means to say this: if I come to you and I say, I want to do this, and here's my explanation. Now, to be sure, the real reason I want to do it is because I want to, because it gives me delight. But I don't want to get myself locked up, so I don't come and say, well, I want to do it, and if you're in my way, I'm going to run you over. Instead, I say, I want to do it, and here's my explanation. You can respond to that. You can say, well, I hear your explanation, here is my counter-argument, here are my objections, this is why I think that this is not so simple and not so correct, and so forth. So, by communicating the message of my soul, using my tools, my koiches, mind, heart, senses, and so forth, I am making it possible for an infinite soul to interact with other infinite souls in a finite space, in a shared space, because we are containing, we are limiting the infinity of the soul to form, to detail, which because of its limitation and because of its interactive possibility makes it possible for two souls, and in fact for billions of souls, to share the same planet, to share the same space, and for the most part get along. So the tools act as vehicles to allow the soul to interact with other souls. So what are those tools doing? Are they helping the soul, or are they hindering the soul, impairing the soul? And of course the answer is obviously both. They're impairing and hindering the soul because the smartest person in the world can't really explain his or her deepest motivations. Because the deepest motivations of the human being come from their subconscious, from their essence, from their soul, which is an urgency, a will that's infinite, or a delight that's rich and inexplicable. But the tools that allow me to interact and communicate with another human being allow the soul to communicate its message in part, in such a way that it can be shared and negotiated in a world where many souls share the same space. So, the tools on the one hand cover over the power of the soul, but at the same time they serve a very useful purpose for the soul, communication. Or to use a more mystical term, revelation. So let's repeat ourselves. The highest level of the soul is Gilui HaNefesh, when the soul speaks soulese, the language of the soul itself. And in such a universe, there's only room for one soul. It's almost that simple. Then, of course, you have the tools or faculties of the soul. These tools streamline, they limit, they focus the soul in through specific attributes, mind, heart, senses, none of which can communicate the true infinity of the soul, but they can communicate enough of what the soul intends for the soul to interact with other souls and to cohabit with other souls. Those are called the tools. The third dimension of the neshama is called the levushim, the garments. The garments are thought, speech, and action. Thought is how I talk to myself. Speech is how I talk to other human beings. And action is how I talk to those less than me. Animals, plants, and minerals. The garments are the actual communication. What I communicate is what's in my heart and my mind and my senses. How I communicate is using words. Words of thought, words of speech, or words of action. Now, there's a very big difference between the tools of the soul, my mind, my heart, and my senses, and thought, speech, and action. And the difference is very simple. If I understand something to be true, I cannot easily change my mind. If I feel a certain emotion to be just, I can't easily change my feelings. But I can change what I think in a minute. I can just think a different thought. I can change what I'm saying in a heartbeat. I can say different words. Or I can even do the impossible and actually keep my mouth closed and say nothing. So the outermost dimension of the soul, which is called the garments, are much further removed from the soul itself, are very, very easily replaced and exchanged, and are considered a much greater concealer of the soul itself. In other words, the tools cover over the soul, but they're very helpful to the soul. The garments are helpful to the tools, but in helping the tools, they're really compromising what the soul is able to communicate much, much more. Let me summarize, okay? The soul has three dimensions: an inner dimension, a middle dimension, and an outer dimension. The inner dimension of the soul is the soul's plain infinity, which is represented by will and delight. The middle dimension of the soul is the tools that streamline or contain or contract the soul into form that's interactively constructive, but they communicate what the soul wants. The garments, which is the most peripheral level of the soul, also communicates what the soul wants, but it uses words that do a very poor job in communicating the true richness of what the soul is trying to share. The next 20 lines or so are going to analyze the special connection that exists between level 2 and level 1 of the soul. In other words, the Hebrew is Giluyim, Keiches, and Levushim. The Alter Rebbe wants to argue that although the Keiches, meaning the tools, compromise the Giluyim, what the soul is by itself, incredibly, but they're incredibly intimately connected to the Giluyim. In other words, notwithstanding that they cannot say what the infinity of the soul experiences in its infinity, but they so well represent it, they're so closely connected to the infinity of the soul that it's almost as if you were to say that notwithstanding their being finite and diverse, they're actually representing the infinity of the soul. And of course, the nimshal is going to be the Sefiros, the tools, and the Ein Sof. But that will come soon. Back to the text. Line 11. If you wanted to explain the connection between levels 2 and 1, which is Koiches and Giluyim, the best example would be the soul and the body. How one are a soul and a body? A soul is spiritual. A body is physical. That's quite different. Yet the fusion, the coming together of the soul and the body is so perfect, so whole, that they are literally like one. Listen to the Alter Rebbe explain this. Although the body is a garment for the soul, and of course the connotation here is the body, more than anything else, hides, obstructs the infinity of the soul. At the same time, the fusion of the soul and the body is such that when the body feels something, the soul also feels it. In other words, they literally, two opposites, spiritual and material, fuse, become one. If someone stubs his finger, the life force, the soul feels it. And the same is true alternatively, that when the soul wants something, the body's response is spontaneous. When the soul decides it wants to do something, using the body, like moving its arm or leg and so forth, the body cooperates and responds to this desire, take off from yad, spontaneously. When one decides to do a particular deed, the soul says walk, It doesn't take 15 minutes to process that message. It is virtually spontaneous. The foot to walk. As soon as you say go, you move. Without it taking time to communicate from the brain to the foot. And what this demonstrates is the degree of unity between the soul and the body. Because if the soul and the body lacked unity, there were two things interacting. And yet somehow we're not very intimate. It would take a substantial amount of time, a measurable amount of time, a deliberate amount of time for the body to do as the soul wishes. And in reality, we see it's virtually spontaneous. The body is told by the soul to react, and it reacts. As soon as you want, you do. Why is this? The answer is that although a body and a soul are so distinctive, are so different, but they fuse, they come together as a virtual oneness. The reason for this is the body joins with the soul. The soul is able to effectively operate through the body as it wishes. As though the body and the soul are one and the same thing. Though the body is merely a garment, a representative of the soul in the physical plane, it joins with the soul. Think about this. The garment of the soul is the body. What is the garment of the body? My jacket. Are they the same? Can you say that the relationship between my clothing and my body is the same as the relationship between my body and my soul? The answer, of course, is not, for various reasons. First of all, you can change clothing. Can't change bodies. Second of all, even the clothing that we wear, which is tailored to our body, is not unique to us. Somebody else can put on the same clothes if they're approximately the same size. We can change clothes very readily because the clothing that we wear, the garments that we wear, although they help represent us, are very separated from our organic self, from our living self. While the body, although the body is a physical thing, is incredibly intimately connected to the life force, the spiritual life force, the soul which is inside of itself. So let's say that the soul, the body, and the clothing we wear would correspond to the three ideas I told you in my introduction. Giluyim, keches, and levushim, where garments are very secondary. The argument that's important to us is to say that although the soul is infinite and plane, or spiritual, and the faculties are finite and complex, or physical, these two distinctive things somehow achieve a very special kind of a unity, that they're virtually inseparable. Line 18. We can apply the metaphor of the union between a soul and a body to inyan haseichel v'hamidus shel hanefesh, the relationship between my mind and my heart and my senses. That means my tools of communication and interaction and the infinite plane, non-interactive soul itself. Shehein gam kein, that these tools are simply rak bechinas tikunim, decorations, representatives and beautifiers of ulavushim and garments. Shan nefesh mistakenes umislabeshes bahen, the soul needs them to present itself and to beautify itself in its relationship with another soul. Ve'enkli hanefesh, they're simply tools of the soul. Shabahen val yadan pe'als hanefesh, which allows the soul to function. Tigaz and as a craftsman uses a hammer, so a soul uses faculties. The soul by itself, without a mind and a heart and senses, cannot communicate with anything in anybody and live in any relationships whatsoever. So it needs these tools. For example, to love, using the specific faculty of love. To be intellectually intuitive and creative, using the faculty of wisdom. That all of these phenomena are not the soul itself, because the soul by itself is infinite and an etzem. You know what an etzem means? An essence. Do you know what an essence means? An etzem. Do you know what an etzem means? An essence. I have a problem with the word essence because it doesn't mean anything. And instead of translating etzem as essence, which is helpful to nobody, I translate etzem as anything in its relationship with itself. The soul is an etzem. It exists in its own universe, has no relationships with anything other than itself, period. The faculties, the tools, are its vehicles for interaction. And therefore, continues the Rebbe, and he says, for the purposes of the soul's function and interaction, it needs tools. They're only necessary for the relationship between the soul, what's beyond itself. While the soul as it exists by itself, for itself, and in itself, is removed from all of the above. Okay? So, arguably, your soul doesn't need tools, and the tools simply serve a purpose of interaction, which would make them, in the world of the soul, not that important. But you'll find out soon that perhaps they're not that important, but they're incredibly linked, incredibly joined with the infinite plainness and the soul as it exists in relationship with itself. But Alter Rebbe makes his point. What's the proof that the tools, the mind, the heart, and the senses are completely outside of the soul as it exists in relationship with itself? The answer is, the faculties of the person, mind, heart, and senses change. All of us know that when it comes to emotions, there are changes. Young people are interested in silly things, and as we grow, we change our interests for more meaningful things. This is true emotionally. And similarly, our wisdom, our intelligence, as we age, we become saged, and so forth. Line 23, in the soul as it exists in relationship with itself, it's an infinite plainness. There's no moods. It's a constant. The soul is as unchanging as God himself. It's always the same. It's not subject to any changes whatsoever. I don't have time for the philosophy, but this is really worth exploring. The question of changing versus an unchanging being. And from a philosophical perspective, to be true, to be absolute, you have to be never changing. Because if you change ever, any condition you're in is what's called in the world of philosophers mikre, coincidental. So it's not real. Only something which never changes is true. So the faculties of the soul, because they evolve and change, are not the essence. They're only garments. And the essence of the soul doesn't change when the body changes. Because the very essence of the soul as it exists in relationship with itself, is not in the body in such a way that as the body evolves, the soul evolves. A part of the soul comes into the body. And in fact, the part of the soul that goes into the body does fuse, become one with the body to the degree that as the body feels, the soul feels, as the body changes and ages, the soul matures and so forth and so on. But the essence is removed from all of that. Ella only ha'areseha v'keicheseha, its lights and its tools, its faculties, sheheina mispashtes beguf, that manifest in the body, umislapshes and reveal themselves within the dynamic, complex body, hein mekablim shinuyim, they are affected by change, mitzad haguf, because the body changes. Hamakabel b'katan kach, that the body can receive the soul in an immature person in one way, ubezakin kach, and an immature person in a different way, and so forth. So the soul by itself is not subject to change. The body by itself is constantly changing. The aspect of the soul that connects to the body, namely the faculties, is correspondingly changing, evolving. And therefore it's, quote, removed from the soul. And this is true also of our intelligence and our passions. They're only emanations from and tools of the soul, that manifest into the body, and they're not the soul as it exists in relationship with itself, because if they were the soul itself, they wouldn't be subject to change and division. And the fact that they're subject to division and change is an indication of the fact that they're not the essence. But on the other hand, Ella it is only Shahanefesh, Payeles, Umispashetes, Bekeiches, V'ha'aresel. The soul functions using these tools and lights. So these 10 lines or so have communicated the distance between the tools of the soul and the soul itself. They're, quote, just outside of the soul. But there's a flip side to that. And the flip side to that is that through these faculties, the soul itself speaks. Line 27. These faculties, mind, heart, and senses, are not separate garments. As would be clothing, thought, speech, and deed. They are garments that truly block and cover over the soul. The mind and the heart, the faculties, are all on the one hand. Their dynamism and diversity indicates that they're outside the soul itself, and just for the purposes of interaction, but they represent the soul so intimately and so profoundly that through them the soul actually speaks. They are reflections of the soul as it exists by itself. They're not garments that cover, but garments that decorate and present. That the soul in its essence, in other words, the soul as it exists by itself, is decorated and beautified through them. In other words, it's as if you were to say that the soul needs the faculties. Now, the soul doesn't need the faculties. The soul's interaction needs the faculties. But the faculties are so intimate. Our mind and our heart and our senses are so close to the atzmos of the nefesh, as if they're beautifying the nefesh itself. K'mei tikun hatachshit, like jewelry, shu hamayapes adam, it doesn't only cover the person, it beautifies the person. Shemeskashet boyu misno, it decorates and beautifies the person. The faculties beautify the soul. There's an expression in my Maamar Chassidus that I want to share that makes this argument in a phrase. And the lashon is hakoiches afal pi she'enam atzmiyim mikomokim harehem nafshiyim, which means to say, although the faculties and tools of the soul are not essence, they're not infinite and plain and existing as the soul does in relationship with itself, they are of the soul, nafshiyim. In other words, they are tools and aspects, but they fuse with the soul and represent the soul in so healthy a way that, in effect, they are representatives of the soul. Through them, the soul itself communicates. This is a mashal. This is half the story. This is the analog. What is it analogous to? It's analogous to the Sefiros. Understand that the Sefiros are godliness. My brain is not infinite. Chochmah v'atzilus is both wisdom and infinity at the same time. If you understand that, please explain it to me, because it really is not a simple thing to comprehend. There's different shittas in Kabbalah. Some Maimorim call them koyach hagavul, some Maimorim call them gavul mamish. You do that all for homework, and I wish you lots of luck. But the Sefiros are individual attributes: wisdom, understanding, knowledge, kindness, strength, beauty, and so forth, that on the one hand are distinctive attributes, and at the same time are representative of Ant, of the Ein Sof. This is a contradiction. These two notions, that on the one hand the Sefiros are individual attributes, and on the other hand these individual attributes are representative of the infinity of godliness, is very difficult to comprehend, because there's a two-sidedness to it, there's a duality to it. Are they individual faculties? Are they limited faculties? Or are they one infinite representative of the plain infinite light of godliness? And the real answer is both. How could it be both? Very hard to understand. But the aforementioned mashal, the aforementioned analog, is meant to make it easier. By understanding the way our faculties represent our soul, the way our mind, heart, and senses communicate our subconscious will in a constructive way in an interactive world. Although they are limited and the subconscious, the infinite soul is infinite, yet they are so intimately bound up in one another that in their affinity they are somehow able to represent the infinite, is meant to ease our ability to wrap our minds around this idea. The infinite Ein Sof is represented by individual attributes, chesed, gevura, chochmah, bina, that both limit the infinity because that's what representation means and communication means, El Hazulas, and at the same time, truly represent the plane infinity.